Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Nicholas Pilfold from San Diego Zoo Global, and I am part of the Earth Lesson Live series, and so happy to be here today to talk to you. I'm going to speak to you today on polar bears, which is one of the animals that I conduct research on, and I'm going to talk about some of the common questions I get about polar bears. And if you have questions, please go ahead and type them in the feed, and I'll try to answer them as we go along, so it can be a live Q&A. Apologies for last time if you tuned in expecting me, had some technical difficulties, so I'm really glad that I'm able to be here today to talk to you in this great series that has been lined up by Liz Daly. So a little bit about me. I work for San Diego Zoo Global as a conservation scientist, and I work on a variety of large carnivores, polar bears included, leopards, and as well as Andean bears. I collaborate on projects with them, and giant pandas. So it's a really neat project, a really neat role that I get to do at San Diego Zoo. One of the questions that I often get working at a zoo is what does your job look like? And do you just work with the animals at the zoo, or do you do research? And what I do actually is I work in the field on conservation programs. So San Diego Zoo is an amazing conservation organization. We have many scientists that work for us around the world on different projects on the ground to protect the species the best we can. And there are other zoos around the world that do the same. So zoos can be fantastic conservation organizations and do great work. And so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work I do on polar bears up there, and talk to you a little bit about some of the questions that I get when I talk to people about polar bears, some of the curiosities they have. And please, if you would, just go ahead and type any questions that you have into the feed there, and I'll be happy to do my best to answer them. First question that I often get is how many polar bears are there in the world, and how do we know? So the answer to the question is actually a little bit more complicated than it might seem. We have an estimate that there are about 23,000 polar bears living currently in the world, but we have never been able to go out and capture all or count all the bears at the same time. Polar bears live across a massive Arctic landscape, so 3 times the continental size of the United States. And so they move around this very remote, very difficult place to work in. And so it's difficult to go out and count polar bears. So for about half of the populations, we don't actually have a good estimate on the number of bears that live there. So the number that we have, that 23,000, actually comes from areas there we know how many polar bears there are, and then we can project, based on the type of habitat, how many bears we expect in these places that we can't get to count. But yeah, the reality behind it is that no one's actually ever counted all the bears all at once. And so sometimes I get questions like, well, I've heard that there are more polar bears than there ever have been before, or that there are less. And the truth to it is that we only know about the particular populations that we work in, how they're doing specifically, but we've never been able to count the global total. So you should be suspicious of anyone who ever tries to tell you that there are more polar bears than ever. Because as a scientist, I can tell you that I don't actually have that information. What has happened over the past sort of 30, 40 years of research is that in the 1970s, early 70s, and even late 60s, there was concern that polar bears were being hunted at too high of a frequency, that there was no management on their harvest, and that the bear populations were in decline. And so the countries that manage bear populations, Canada, Norway, Denmark, the United States, and Russia, they all came together and signed an agreement saying that they would manage their polar bear populations, they would count polar bears, and manage the harvest. And that's really when we started the research that we currently do now, is based on that management. So that's where the whole story of counting polar bears comes from. But simple answer, how many polar bears are there? About 23,000 is our best estimate, but we've never done a complete count. Another question that I often get is, what does it look like to work on the ground with polar bears? How are they doing? What do you see when you go out onto the sea ice? So one of the things that I get to do as part of my research is I accompany teams of researchers out onto the sea ice, and we interact with the bears directly. So we take measurements from the bears, we assess their health and how well they're doing. And so you get right up close to polar bears that way. We have to tranquilize the bears from the air in order to do that. And then we land by the bears and we take our measurements. From where I work in the Hudson Bay, one of the things that we've seen over a long period of time is that the bears' condition and their health and how fat and good looking they are is directly related to how the sea ice is doing. So it's very difficult when you're in the field on any given day to say, how the bears look compared to a long history of data. So we really have to look at the data over a long period of time. It's one of the things that we do as a scientist. And when we look at that data, what we see is that the condition of the bears directly relates to how much sea ice is available to those bears. So the more time that they get to spend on their home and their habitat, the better condition they're in, because the more seals they get to eat. A question came in from Twitter: how often do I work out in the field with polar bears? So for myself, I get to go out once a year. I participate in a program in Hudson Bay, Canada, with my partner organizations in Environment Canada and the University of Alberta. And that period of work lasts for about 3 to 4 weeks, usually starts in early April and ends in May. One of the reasons that we work during that period of time is that the sea ice is in some of the best conditions, the safest for us to be out there, to be working via helicopter and landing. The light conditions are getting better. So in the Arctic, the sea ice gets to its maximum extent in about March. So if you hit that window in April, that's a really good time to go access the bears. Another question came in: do I work with Jeff York and Eric Regier? I know Jeff York and Eric Regier. I have actually not worked directly with them in the field. I do know of their research in Hudson Bay and research that they've done in Alaska and other places. Both very talented researchers, but I have not had the joy of working alongside them directly. That's a great question. So what's happening on the ground? Well, this is where we get our information. So when we get down on the ground with the bears, one of the things that we do is we can measure the weight of the bear by taking a tape measurement. We measure the girth and the length of the bear. From that, we can calculate how much the bear weighs. We also check on the bear and see how fat it is. We give it a fatness test, which is actually very rigorous, although all we really do is we put our hand on the bear and we kind of just give it a bit of a jiggle, essentially, to see how much fat deposits there, and then we rate the bear on a scale of 1 to 5. Along with a number of other metrics that we take, we can determine then how well the bears have been doing relative to the sea ice conditions. One other question I get with working with bears, with polar bears in particular, is what is it like to work with a polar bear? Are they aggressive? What's it like compared to other large carnivores? I would have to say, working with polar bears, they are an exceptionally dangerous animal. You have to be very careful while working around polar bears and take a lot of safety considerations into your thoughts about how you're going to work with them. But I wouldn't actually call polar bears aggressive. I've also worked around grizzlies, and I would find that grizzly bears are more aggressive in their personality than polar bears are. So there was a study that was conducted up in the Beaufort Sea, and in the Beaufort Sea, you get these whaling harvests that happen on the Alaskan side, and they leave big carcasses on the land once they're done taking the whale meat, the traditional harvest. And so these whale carcasses that are left, polar bears and grizzly bears, they'll show up onto these carcasses and they will both feed. And usually they get along, but they've done studies on the interactions between grizzlies and polar bears. And despite the fact that polar bears outweigh and are bigger than grizzly bears are actually able to push polar bears off. They're just a bit more aggressive, have a bit more of a somewhat of a nasty demeanor to them. I mean, they're just a bit more of an aggressive animal relative to a polar bear. When I talk about polar bears and grizzlies, though, then the next question I usually get is about hybrids. Everybody is always very interested about polar bear, grizzly bear offspring and hybridizations that have occurred. We kind of call them pizzlies or growlers. And the reality of it is this made a lot of news a few years ago because there was a paper that was published on all the hybrids that they recorded in the Beaufort Sea in the Canadian side and a little bit north in a place called Viscount Melville Sound. And I was actually part of the research team that saw some of these observations of hybrid bears out in the environment. It turns out that really it came down to just a couple individuals that were crossbreeding. So this wasn't something that was extensive through the population. This is actually still a very rare event between grizzlies and polar bears. Grizzly bears and polar bears, when they mate, they can have successful offspring, and those offspring can also reproduce themselves. So their species relationship is close enough that they can have these hybrid offspring. One of the questions I get with the hybrids, though, is, so are these like super bears? Can they do anything? Can they go on land? Can they go on sea ice and do both? Is this sort of what the future of climate change looks like? And the reality is that these bears are actually less likely to be successful than a polar bear or a grizzly bear, a sort of purebred. And the reason for that is that so far what we've seen for these hybrids is that they're born to polar bear mothers. And what the hybrids will do is they'll follow their mothers and learn the polar bear lifestyle. So when a cub is born, it follows its mother for about 2.5 years and learns everything there is to understand how to make a living on the sea ice. The problem with the hybrids, though, is that they often have characteristics of both species. So the adaptations that polar bears have to living on a sea ice environment don't necessarily translate to the hybrid offspring. Sometimes they can have a differential coloration in their coat. Their heads can be a little bit blockier, which may mean that for them, accessing the seal prey that polar bears do may be a little bit difficult. But we don't actually have any really good data on it because it's still a very rare event. Okay, we got some questions coming in. I'm just gonna take a look here. Has the current situation impacted my research? Yeah, so the lockdown has this year. We have not been able to go out into the field as we usually do. Actually, this is the first time, I believe, in 40 years of research, according to some of our partners, that we haven't been able to go. So like many programs right now, we're all at home and doing our best. And it's a good time as a scientist to catch up on the things that you need to do, which is often writing the publications and analyzing the data that comes along with all the research that we do. So yeah, this year we've had to stay at home and we're gonna sort of retool and reorganize and figure out what we need to do next year. And that's been the case across all of the programs that I'm involved in. Okay, so a few questions have come in about growler bears or pizzlies, about whether it's genetically identifiable. So the paper that I'm referring to, we had the samples from all the bears, so we were able to identify their genetic heritage. And what was really neat about it was that there were some bears that had 3/4 grizzly, 1/4 polar bear. So that means that one parent was a hybrid and one parent was a purebred or pure, grizzly bear. So what that suggests is that hybrids are, as I mentioned, reproductively viable. They can have offspring themselves, which is usually, if you think about the old textbook definition of what a species is, it means that it's reproductively isolated from other species. It can't necessarily have viable offspring. If it hybridizes as hybrids, is sort of the end of the road. But because polar bears and grizzlies are so closely related over their evolutionary past, they're able to have these hybrids that can then reproduce themselves, which is very interesting. But again, it's still something that is very rare for us to see. One of the other questions I get when we start talking about polar bear evolution and grizzly bears and polar bears is about the evolution of polar bears. When do we think they evolved? And then about their history relative to the historical changes we've seen in the sea ice over the years in the Arctic with glaciation cycles that the planet naturally goes through relative to what we're seeing now with climate change. So that's a big question. I'll unpack it a little bit. So for the evolution of polar bears, their closest relative is the grizzly bear, and so we believe the polar bears evolved from grizzly bears. When they evolved is still an estimate. We could be as young as 250,000 years ago, as old as 1,000,000 years ago. The reason that it's such a wide estimate of when they diverged from grizzly bears is we don't have a great fossil record to go by. So when polar bears die, most of them die on sea ice, and then those remains drop to the bottom of the ocean. And because of this potential for grizzlies and polar bears to hybridize, there's actually been what we call integration over the historic genetic record. So there's a lot of DNA that polar bears and grizzly bears share, and it makes it hard to find the points within the DNA to figure out when exactly they separated. So this is why there's this big error in the estimate. Now, it is true that polar bears have lived through warming periods in the past. The one that comes to mind for sure is the Nemean, which is about 135,000 years ago, where temperatures were warmer than they are today, and sea ice was less than it was today. So one of the questions that comes up is, how do polar bears make it through this period of time, and what does that mean for polar bears for today? So context is really important when these kind of questions come up. The first piece of context is that the changes that we're seeing today in terms of how fast the climate is moving is faster than it ever has before. And sea ice scientists suggest that within the next 100 years, in terms of the sea ice record, we could be in a place that we haven't seen in the last 1,000,000 years. So we could quickly get to a place that even surpasses what polar bears would have seen in the Nemean. During the Nemean, when polar bear were living on reduced ice, some colleagues have worked out that whales would have played probably a fairly large role in maintaining polar bear populations around the Arctic. Whale populations today, the populations that we see, are far reduced from where they used to be prior to the advent of human harvesting. So these whale carcasses that would have washed on shore can easily sustain numbers of polar bears over the years. And we've even found a jaw remains in Svalbard that dates back to this period in time. And when they did an isotope analysis of the jaw, what they found is that the bears were still depending on marine resources. The isotopes linked to the marine environment, which suggests that bears were still feeding in this way. How could that be? Well, the suggestion is that potentially scavenging whale carcasses would have really helped bears through these low periods of time. So one more question that's come in here. I'll take a couple more while we got a little bit of time on the live chat. How is hunting of polar bears regulated? Is hunting legal everywhere in the Arctic, and why do they hunt them? Really good question. So hunting is not legal everywhere in the Arctic. In Russia, it is illegal. In Norway, it is illegal except in defense of life. We have harvested traditional harvests in Canada. That is a regulated program through the government. So it's a tag-based program. So they set tags based on the number of bears that are each managed population. This is the same for Greenland. The hunting, why do they hunt them? It's a traditional harvest. So for the thousands of years that the Inuit have lived in the Arctic, they have hunted polar bear as part of the sustainable harvest and their livelihood, and that continues to this day. And so the great thing in a way about the management of this harvest is it's actually provided us the ability to do all the science that we do now. So everything that we know about polar bears has come out of this agreement that we need to manage the harvest. To manage the harvest, you need to know how many bears there are and how well they're doing, and that's where they employ scientists like us to go get that information so that we can make the best decisions possible. So last question here on the feed, which is a really good one, and one that I commonly get is can polar bears survive climate change and predicted human population growth? I can't answer the question about population growth because that one is just sort of one step removed from climate change, but climate change itself, it really depends on our own actions. So there was a publication that some polar bear scientists put together about 10 years ago, and they showed that depending on the trajectory that we take with our emissions can mean whether or not we still have polar bears on our planet. We can change the emissions, and if we do so early enough, we can make sure that there's enough sea ice available so that we still have a wild population of polar bears. So that really comes down to the choices that we all make. And that's the question I'll end the live feed on today, which I usually get is you know, what can we do? What's the best thing that we can do to protect polar bears so that we have wild polar bears for generations to come? And my answer to that is that we need to, as individuals, make the best choices that we can, and the most impactful choices that we can make are actually around transportation. So the biggest choice that we can all make is not to fly as regularly. That has the biggest impact on carbon footprint and reducing our carbon footprint. And one of the nice things about what's happened with the current situation in the world is, for me anyway, I've really started to notice all the wildlife that's just outside the door. You know, the hummingbirds that live here in San Diego. I go visit the sea lions down in the bay. So just, you know, it's not always necessary that we have to hop in a plane and go somewhere. We can make choices close to home. That also, you know, reflects the type of choices we make about our daily commutes. Can you walk or bike to work or school? That's a really important one. Here in California, 1/3 of the emissions comes from vehicle traffic. So the more that we can do to reduce that, the better it is for the environment. And also where your food comes from. So food can have a huge transportation component. So buying food that's locally grown from your local farmers, very important in reducing carbon footprint. And the last thing I will have to say, and I do believe strongly in, is that there is only so much that we can do as individuals. We need to act as a society. And it needs to come at a higher level than just our own individual choices. It's important that we make the right choices and do what we can. But it's also important that we urge our representatives in government to follow through on commitments that were made in Paris, commitments yet to come, that they follow through in a meaningful way. That's the only way that we're going to have polar bears around. There may be arguments about, you know, exactly how fast the decline is going to come and what's going to happen to polar bears and how fast sea ice is going to disappear. But one thing is clear is if we keep doing what we're doing, we're paving a road to losing bears in the wild, and that's not something I want to see. So, you know, just taking a moment to tweet or write your representative can go a long way to make sure that they're not forgetting that it's a priority that we transition to a green economy. Great, I think that is my time. I really enjoyed speaking to you all and getting your questions. Hopefully I answered everything, and maybe I can do this again if we're all still in the same place. Anyway, a big hello from San Diego, California. Hope you're all doing well. Stay healthy, stay happy. Bye, everyone.